A History Overview of Minority Rights by Trina Walker. During the 19th century, women became increasingly active in the quest for their own suffrage. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and others refused to endorse the 15th Amendment. As a result of the conflict, two organizations emerged. Stanton and Anthony formed the National Woman Suffrage Association to work for suffrage on the federal level. In 1890, the two groups united under the name National American Women's Suffrage Association. In 1853, Susan B. Anthony inaugurated a petition campaign to help secure married women the right to retain their own wages and have equal guardianship of their children. In 1853, Anthony wrote a letter to George W. Johnson, a Buffalo attorney, to ask him for his assistance in drawing up forms of petitions to present to the legislature. In 1854, she presented to the New York State Legislature petitions containing 10,000 signatures. In 1871, a petition signed by Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady, and many other suffragists was sent to Congress asking that voting rights be given to women. The petition also asked that women be given the right to speak in Congress. Susan B. Anthony was a prominent civil rights leader who played a pivotal role in the 19th century women's rights movement to introduce women's suffrage in the United States. Susan was one of the important advocates in the leading way for women's rights to be acknowledged and instituted in the American government. After much debate at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, convened by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, they had challenged America to social revolution that would touch every aspect of life. Early women's rights leaders believed suffrage to be the most effective means to change an unjust system. By the late 1800s, early 1900s, nearly 15 years of progress afforded women advancement in property rights, employment, educational opportunities, divorce and child custody laws, and increased social freedoms. Although Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton devoted 50 years to the women's suffrage movement, neither lived to see women gain the right to vote, but their work and that of many other suffragists contributed to the ultimate passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. In 1863, Anthony and Stanton organized the Women's National Loyal League to support the petition for the 13th Amendment outlawing slavery. They went on to campaign for full citizenship for women and people of any race, including the right to vote, in the 14th and 15th Amendments. Stanton's commitment to female suffrage caused a schism in the women's rights movement when she, together with Susan B. Anthony, declined to support passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution. Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison met with anti-Quakers at their farm almost every Sunday. In 1856, Anthony became an agent for the American Anti-Slavery Society, arranging meetings, making speeches, putting up posters, and distributing leaflets. She encountered hostile mobs, armed threats, and things thrown at her. As the years go by, the fight for equal rights continued years later into the Civil Rights Movement and down into the Civil Rights Act for all U.S. citizens, no matter of nationality. In the later 1960s, the targets of King's activisms were less often the legal and political obstacles to exercise the civil rights by blacks and more often the underlying poverty, unemployment, lack of education, and blocked avenues of economic opportunity confronting black Americans. Dr. King was the driving force behind events such as the Montgomery bus boycott and the March on Washington, which helped bring about such landmark legislation as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. By refusing to give up her seat to a white man on a Montgomery, Alabama city bus in 1955, black seamstress Rosa Parks helped initiate the civil rights movement in the United States. The leaders of the local black community organized a bus boycott that began the day Parks was convicted of violating the segregation laws. Led by Dr. King, the boycott lasted more than a year, during which Parks lost her job and continued on as one of the activist leaders. Deputy Director Bayard Rustin, a civil rights veteran and organizer of the 1947 Journey of the Reconciliation, the first of the Freedom Riders to test a Supreme Court ruling that banned racial discrimination in interstate travel. Rustin was a longtime associate of both Randolph and Dr. King, with Randolph concentrating on building the March's political coalition. Rustin built and led a team of activists and organizers who publicized the march. He recruited the marchers, coordinated the buses and trains provided by the marshals for a mass march in the nation's capital. The Great March on Washington was one of the largest political rallies for human rights in the United States history and called for civil and economic rights for African Americans. It took place in Washington, D.C. on Wednesday, August 28, 1963. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his historic I Have a Dream speech, advocating racial harmony at the Lincoln Memorial during the march. The march was organized by a group of civil rights, labor, and religious organizations under the theme Jobs and Freedom. The number of participants varied from 200,000 police to over 300,000 leaders of the march. The focus of the Madison County movement was voter registration. Out of 10,000 voters, only 121 blacks were registered in 1963. Those who dared try to register or vote were threatened by gun-wielding officials. Another tactic that prevented blacks from voting was the poll tax. The Civil Rights Act was sent to Congress by President Johnson on March 17, 1965. The bill passed the Senate on May 26, 1965. After a successful closure vote on March 23rd by a vote of 77 to 19, after 5 weeks of debate, it was finally passed on July 9th. After differences between the two bills were resolved in conference, the House passed the conference report on August 3rd, 1965, the Senate on August 4th, 1965. Then on August 6, 1965, President Johnson signed the act into law with Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and other civil rights leaders in attendance. As history explains how the fight of democracy and equal rights have been won, we still face the fight today, and so do our future generations. Take part in coming together and have your voices heard. For more information about the history of minority rights, go to history.com. Thank you for listening.